Okay, so I want to give you the good news. You guys have now gone through and gotten beyond the most complicated elements in this class. We're going to introduce one in just a minute. It's going to seem complicated, but once you start to digest it, it won't be. But we've done all the most complicated things together. We're now going to be effectively utilizing these and just doing them over and over and over again in different scenarios and with different forms. But there's only one other thing I'm going to teach you that's really different, and it's a simple thing that I've already given you in one of the problem sets a hint to. But we won't even deal with that tonight. We'll deal with it next week. So I want to go now and I want to look at valuation model structures. And you'll recognize that I've already given you a hint to this because I've shown you some of this as we go through it. But I want to ask the question, should an asset's value differ based upon the valuation model being applied to it? Or should the value be the value?
Well, wouldn't the value be subjective? Well, like there's a market price, but it might be more valuable to you and what you're doing than, say, someone on the street.
Well, in fact, I think, Scott, we just evidenced that, didn't we? More valuable to the new owners, even at their discount rate, because of what they would do with it, than it was to the existing owners. So absolutely, but that's not a function of model. I use the same model each way here. That's a function of other elements coming to the table. But with respect to models themselves, would I expect to see the asset have a different value just because of the model that we're applying to it? Well, I would think not, right? I mean, if it's a shoe manufacturer and it's worth $90 million, it's a shoe manufacturer worth $90 million. And we know the WACC or required returns and all these other things have gone into that, but it is worth what it's worth. Similarly, it shouldn't make any difference whether we're going to buy it for all cash or we're going to buy it with some debt and some cash. It's worth what it's worth. When you buy a house in the marketplace, the seller couldn't care less if you have all the cash or if you only have part of the cash and have already negotiated a mortgage for the rest, right? Makes no difference. Oh, sometimes we'll think about a difference between cash and having to get some debt, but that's only because we know that the sale is going to go through and it can happen quickly. The person doesn't have to wait to get approval, okay? But by and large, the house that sells all cash and the house that sells for cash and some mortgage sells at the exact same price if it's the exact same house. Well, businesses are the same way. And similarly, shouldn't matter what model we're using to value the asset's value should be what the asset's value is. Okay? And I'm going to expose you to 3 or 4 different models tonight, 1 or 2 of which you already have an inkling to, maybe more than that. And we'll look at some different forms here. We'll look at the free cash flow model, which frankly we've already looked at. We're going to look at the KVD model, which is only a slight alteration off the free cash flow model, and then we'll look at this adjusted present value model, which you're going to swear is a big deal difference, and I'm going to tell you it's a tiny difference than the free cash flow model. We have single stage models and we have multi-stage models. So let's give an example on these. So you might recognize this first model, value at time 0, being equal to some cash flow at time 1, divided by a discount rate, whatever that happens to be, minus a growth rate. You'll recognize that as the Gordon growth model, right? And you recognize that that takes into account all future cash flows under the assumption that growth rate starting today is constant into perpetuity. Now that might be a broad brushstroke, and that might be an error-prone assumption. But if it is an assumption that we choose to make, if it is credible for whatever reason, it's a model that we can use. This is a single stage model. This has one term to it, and we're done. Okay? And that stage is the Gordon growth model construction. And by the way, this is very similar to the continuing value that you'll see us construct under each of these model forms. Well, then we have a 2-stage or maybe a multi-stage model where we have this same continuing value construction, but it happens out in the future. And we have some explicit period where we have the cash flows, the sum of these cash flows, all discounted for rate and time. And we're going to make the assumption that the growth rate during this explicit period and the growth rate into perpetuity are 2 different rates. Otherwise, if they weren't, we would simply use the simplified single stage model. So we think the growth rates are non-constant. We've got a multi-stage model, and we now can say that the value or the present value of an asset today is the present value of its discounted cash flows. So its cash flows here, discounted for rate and time, plus the present value of its continuing value. And this would be the continuing value right here, modeled after the Gordon growth construction. But since that lives in the future, think back to what we were looking at the beginning of our class tonight in terms of when that number is present as of. It lives in the future. We've got to discount it back to today. So we turn a present value, or we turn this into a present value. We can add it to another present value to give us a present value. All of our valuation model forms will follow that exact same pattern. I sent you a couple of quick sheets that you had in Canvas already, but I sent you a couple of quick sheets. I want to bring those up really quickly now to look at some of this. So there's the valuation model quick sheet, and it shows us, it shows us here the free cash flow model. Let me make this bigger. The free cash flow model, so I've got a present value of a discounted cash flow plus the present value of a continuing value. It shows me the KVD model, present value of a discounted cash flow, the present value of a continuing value. And notice here that the free cash flow model and the KVD model, the first stage is the exact same equation. There's literally, not virtually, literally no difference between these first stages. And the way that we discount into the future, dividing by 1 plus WACC to the t, is the same for our continuation term. So that means the only change, the only difference between these two models exists in the continuing value itself. Well, that's interesting to us. We're going to see that same thing next week when we look at this forward market model as well. So when we look at valuation models in the quick sheet, you can see that. I gave you another quick sheet, valuation model structures, to point this out as well. And the only reason I gave you both of these is because some people can more easily see this in this form than they can see it in the form I just showed you. But otherwise, these two sheets are giving you the exact same piece of information. We've got a value that equals, in this column, the present value of the discounted cash flow plus the present value of the continuing value. And here, we're calculating the continuing values. So in just a basic cash flow model and the free cash flow model and the KVD model, those are the same exactly in each model form. The continuing value changes though. In the free cash flow model, we use free cash flow. So no plat plus depreciation minus change in net working capital minus net capital spending. That's free cash flow, and that's how we use it in the free cash flow model. But remember at the beginning of the block together, I told you about the KVD form of free cash flow, no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROIC. And I told you that there were a couple of conditions in which we would use that. One of them was when we motivated the KVD model. One is when you're told to, and one is when we start to talk about multiples, which we'll start to deal with next week. Well, here's the KVD model. And KVD stands for key value driver. And so the key drivers to cash flow and to value are no plat, growth, and return on invested capital, and WACC. Those are the key drivers. So if we're going to do a sensitivity analysis, we would perhaps use the model and change each of those variables one at a time, see how dynamic the change was given the variable. In each case, the present value of the continuing value is simply whatever the continuing value is, discounted for rate and time back to today, in each case of anything we might want to think about here. So the KVD model and the free cash flow model are almost identical. They're only different in how we think about free cash flow in the continuation. In the free cash flow model, we use free cash flow, no plat plus depreciation minus change in net working capital minus net capital spending as the free cash flow variable. In the KVD model, we use no plat times 1 minus G divided by ROIC. And we know that that is also free cash flow. It's a particular form of it, So it has its own model construction, and we call that the KVD, or key value driver model. Any questions about those two structural elements at the moment? Can you see the difference between a single stage model and a multi-stage model? Okay, what is the one element that separates a single versus a multi-stage model?
Sorry, I was trying the mute button. What was the question again, Rick? Sorry.
What's the one difference between a single versus a multi-stage model?
You're taking the sum?
Well, I'm actually doing a sum as well up here in this single stage, because remember that this single stage, this Gordon growth, actually is the sum of all possible future cash flows. In fact, if I took this, I could, in fact, I'll do this to help you see it real quick. That Gordon growth model is equal to the sum of all the future cash flows discounted for rate time. All of them, the perpetual, the infinite number of them. But there's a single element that causes us to use one of these versus the other.
Is it the growth rates?
Yeah, it's exactly right, Heather. It's the growth rate. When the growth rate in this cash flow is constant over time in perpetuity, then we use the single stage model. When we have at least one change in cash flows, we must go to a multi-stage model. It's just the growth rate of the cash flow variables, period. Okay. Well, it's not very plausible to think that cash flow will grow constantly over time. So we'll rarely use a single stage model. Okay. But they're commonly employed by people just trying to get a rough and dirty estimate. So here we got the free cash flow model, and when we use the WACC and the free cash flows and everything, we came up with a value of 172.78. We're back now into looking at this from Miradravana. Okay. Hang on a second. I thought I changed that. I must not have. Okay. So we're looking at Miradravana again now. And when we do this, we can contrast it with the outcome of the KVD model. Remember, the free cash flow model gave us 172.8, let's say. The free cash flow model, or rather the KVD model gave us 172.28 or 178.3. So precious little difference between these. What, half? So $500,000 difference between these two. Now, that's a function of those two different models. And while I might argue that the model forms should give us the exact same outcome, in fact, they don't always give us the exact same outcome. They sometimes give us slightly different outcomes. Well, we talked earlier in the block as to why that is in this case, because this form of calculating free cash flow is heavily dependent upon this G. And when those G's are different, then it gives us a slightly different outcome.
And when would you want to use one calculation for the cash flow over the other?
3 times, Scott. When I tell you to, when you're using the KVD equation, and when we are calculating the algebraic equivalent of a valuation multiple. And those are the only 3 times. I'll even go so far as to tell you that if we lined up 20 valuation analysts, each with nice 6-figure incomes, so doing well at their game, and ask them to tell us what the KVD model is, they'd probably look at you like a deer in the headlights. Most of them don't even know what it is. Okay? So in practical terms, it's not utilized in that consultancy space. So why are we considering it? Because we're not simply thinking about this from the standpoint of being valuation analysts and valuation consultants. We're trying to think about making corporate level decisions, in which case the relationship between ROIC and WACC might be important to us, and we might want to use it to show some of that, the dynamics of that relationship, which we kind of miss in the free cash flow model itself.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, any question before I move on? Let's move to a spreadsheet so I can show you how this worked. I think you're going to get it real fast. So I'll make this small so I can bring everything into focus. all at once. So here, I've got the free cash flow model, I've got the KVD model, and the free cash flow model, they've got the exact same present value of the discounted cash flows. So I told you that those first stages of each of those are virtually and literally identical, okay? But the continuation value is different. And that's the only place that they differ, by the way. And this continuation value takes the free cash flow, divides it by WACC minus G. In this case, we take EBIT, or rather no plat, times 1 minus G divided by ROIC, and then divide that by WACC minus G. So it's simple. The whole difference between these of what, $500,000 is embodied in this continuing value equation, because we're using different forms of free cash flow as a variable in these two equations. And while we would argue that they should yield the same outcome, they've yielded close to the same outcome, and maybe it sets up for us that valuation isn't always a exact dead-on science that's going to give us one number. Maybe it gives us a range of numbers that may be acceptable, because if we're going to do a buying and selling here, there's going to be some give and take in negotiating, isn't there? So it's a range of values, perhaps. Okay, so now I want to stretch your mind just a little bit. And you're going to think that this is new and different, but in fact it's not. So I've suggested that an asset's value is the present value of all of its future cash flows, right? We kind of started our block together that way. And everything we've done thus far is in support of that assertion. We've forecasted the cash flows, forecasting the cost of capital. Everything we've done is simply to support that assertion, assuming that the asset has a singular cash flow. I'm going to suggest that some assets don't have a singular cash flow. So I want you to think about this for a moment. We're going to come back to the free cash flow model. This company has some debt, right? Mira Dravana, we'll go back to its financials. This company has debt on the balance sheet. We can see it right here. And we can see it if we scrutinize the financial statement. And by virtue of the fact that it has debt, it has an interest expense, which are always going to go hand in hand unless the interest rate is 0. So Solomon, I'll let you come off mute here so you can talk to us for a second. If we have an interest expense, will that in any way change our net income?
If it's fixed, then I don't think so. Well, yeah, if it's fixed, it won't change any net income. But if it's not fixed, then we might end up paying.
I'll use you and Kang for just a moment here. So Kang, I'll let you come off and mute. So Solomon, you own this company, and you've capitalized part of it with debt and part of it with equity, right? Such that we've got some interest expense, Solomon, we've got all these free cash flows, everything, we've got what we've got. Kang, if you had an exactly identical company in every respect, or if you bought this company and chose to just pay for it outright because you got the money available to you and didn't use any debt, which of you would have the higher net income?
I would, because I don't have any debt.
Yeah, you would. So your operating income would be the same as your taxable income. Whereas for Solomon, his operating income minus his interest is his taxable income. So which of you will have the higher tax liability?
I think me.
And I think it'll be Kang, because his taxable income will be different. Let's look at this real quickly. So I'm going back over here, and notice where our taxable income is. We're at 29.2 in the face of having a 1.86 interest expense. If I change that to 0, our taxable income goes up to 31.06, and our tax liability's got to go up unless our tax rates have changed as well, right?
Yeah.
So Solomon, that you capitalized the company with debt and had an interest expense means that you have another cash flow to think about. Because whereas Kang would be paying Kang's going to pay 8.076 in taxes, you're only going to pay 7.59 in taxes. And I don't care if you give me cash flow through operations or if you give me cash flow from savings of some kind. Well, here in this case, we have another cash flow. And that cash flow is a function of how we capitalize the asset. And that savings in tax, by the way, is referred to as the tax shield.
Okay.
The tax shield. So I want to think about looking at an asset and looking possibly at two cash flows. The free cash flow is a cash flow, and this tax shield, which is a savings in taxes that we have because we're using debt at some interest rate. And I want to think about aggregating those so that we can find the value of an asset. And we're going to do it in what's called the adjusted present value model. And that model is the value using the APV model is going to be equal to the value of the free cash flow, discounted for rate and time, plus the value of the tax shield, discounted for rate and time. And in each one, we've got the present value of the explicit cash flows, whether they're tax shield or free cash flow, they're still cash flows, plus the present value of the continuing value. So it holds the same form that it's held before. It's just we now have two of them. Let me show them to you in an expanded form. So here we're looking at this, and here I've got the present value of the free cash flows, exactly as you've seen them before, but now you see this pesky little KU thing that was annoying some of you guys when you're doing one of your recent Excel assignments, okay? Well, KU in this case is a different discount rate, and K-tax is going to be yet another discount rate. And they're labeled differently from WACC because they are different than WACC. And we'll talk about that in just a couple moments. But here we've got effectively the free cash flow model, but using a different discount rate. And now we have a model that takes a sum of some cash flow, discounted for rate and time, for the explicit period, and then we take a continuing value and discount it for rate and time of our second cash flow, the tax shield, as a second cash flow. So the APV model is simply the same model construction you've looked at, it's just that we're doing it twice, once for one cash flow and once for the other cash flow, and then we're going to, oops, where did I put this? Right here. And we're going to add them together into this big, ugly, bugly looking thing, which isn't all that bad. That's the free cash flow model. That's the tax shield. Just the sum of these. Does it make sense to you how those are separate cash flows and how we might choose to value the asset using both of them? I want it to. Let it sink in a little bit if it needs to, but it needs to. They are separate and distinct cash flows. They only exist, both of them, when there is debt employed and there's an interest expense being paid.
Maybe can I ask a question, right?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of these things we've been looking at have been investments where we expect a return, whereas tax is kind of a cost savings. It's a cash flow perceived from cost savings, right? Like we're not paying a certain amount of taxes, and that's how we're getting this cash flow.
That's exactly right. As a capitalist, Casey, do you care whether I give you extra cash flow through some savings in cost of goods sold, or an extra cash flow and savings from paying less tax?
Neither. I just think it's important to point out that phrasing because I think,
you're right.
The rest of the projects we've been focusing on, the investments we've been focusing on have not been about, oh, we're saving money because we're not going to pay something.
You're
and
exactly
that can
right.
be perceived as a cash flow.
Right.
And so that's how this one works.
That's exactly right. Now, under the premise that two model forms shouldn't give us meaningfully different outcomes, we've got to think about what's going on here. Let's assume for a moment that we used WACC as the discount rate for each of these two equations, VFCF and VTax, or VTax shield. If that's the case, then this outcome, VFCF, would be exactly the same as this outcome for free cash flow, wouldn't it? Can't possibly be any different if we're using the same cash flows, the same time, and the same discount rate. They must be exactly the same if that's what we're doing. Well, if we're now taking and adding on top of this discounted set of cash flows, yet another cash flow, If the discount rates are all the same, then these two values will be meaningfully different, won't they? Because we would be adding this one to this one. So the free cash flow model would give us a different outcome than the adjusted present value model. And we can't have that because they can't be meaningfully different. So if we know that we're using free cash flow here and we're adding to it some tax shield, what has to be different is the discount rates. So these discount rates of KU and K-tax cannot be the same as WACC. Otherwise, we've got a problem with one model form giving us a completely different value than another model form. So let me show that to you in harsh terms here. I'll go back to Nirvana. So here we've got, I'm gonna go ahead and just for a brief moment, we'll look at replacing this KU and K tax with our WACC. I'll call it 0.13. Well, I'll do this. I'll just say it's this WACC for that one, and it's WACC for this one. So both those discount rates are now the same thing as WACC. And now when I put this together, I go from 172.8 to 177.8. So that's a $5 million spread. And I've already told you really can't have that. They can't be that much different. They should come up with about the same number. Notice in this case, we had a very small tax shield, and the difference is all in the tax shield because we've added the tax shield and it's after discounting effect to the free cash flow model. That's what's going on here because this free cash flow outcome and this free cash flow outcome are the exact same outcome. But what if they're not the same discount rates? Let's change them. Well, now we end up with a different kind of problem. We still have a different value. In fact, it's different the other direction. But we at least have recognized that the value of the two, where they have this one in common, this one has to come up with a different number now. So what I want you to let sink through or sink in with this discussion of the APV model isn't so much about the model form, because frankly, I think that's going to be very easy for you. You're just taking two constructions and adding them together, and they're very similar constructions except for the cash flow variable itself. But then think about, there must be some difference in these discount rates in order for them to come up with the same outcome. Here I've given you some discount rates, and this one happens to be making an assumption that KU is the weighted average cost of equity. It's not RE, which would be specific to the common. It would be the weighted average cost, which is going to take both of our, I don't know that I even have it on here, do I? Thought I had it somewhere.
I think it's below the tax rate on the right side.
Right here. Thank you. Thank you. So I've taken and created a weighted average cost of my equities. Okay. And then K tax, I've taken an after-tax cost of debt. Well, that's what I did in this, and it wasn't satisfying. It gave me, once again, disparate values. 152.7 instead of 172.8. It's a problem for me. Well, why is it a problem? Why can't I just nail KU and K tax as easily as I can nail WACC? I think I can point this out. So Stevie, if you're able to hear us, I'm going to have you come off of mute here for a moment.
All right.
Stevie, do you pay taxes?
Yes,
Does it piss you off?
of course.
I know you just well enough to know that. Do you receive any goods or services because of the taxes you pay?
Yes.
Okay. Arguably, I think we'd have to agree that we do. Fire protection, police protection. We've got departments of state. We have all kinds of stuff. And you as a taxpayer might derive some value from those. Whereas Scott, you as a taxpayer might look at it completely differently. Maybe Stevie never uses a government service in her life, But Scott, you've been benefited because the fire department's come twice and put the fire out at your house. Well, you probably look at that particular service a little bit differently then. It's very discretionary as to how we think about the opportunity cost of paying tax. And sometimes it's flavored by our political ideology. So it's very hard for me to give a good, strong, robust equation and number for K-tax because it is so flavored by our ideology, so flavored by how we utilize goods and services, and frankly, so flavored by the actual value of those goods and services that governments apply for us. We tax, making the assumption that tax dollars pay for those goods and services the governments give us. So K-tax is a elusive and at best fleeting variable. Well, so is KU. So what does KU mean? Well, it's the cost or return of unlevered equity. So Casey will use you and Ball Enterprises at the moment. You've got common stock in the marketplace. You've got preferred stock in the marketplace. You've got debt in the marketplace through bonds. Okay, and you'll probably want to come off mute here to answer this in just a second. And I think we were able to calculate your RE, right? We figured that one out using CAPM, didn't we? Nod your head.
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Casey. It must be getting a little bit late for you here, Dad. And we figured out our RP as well, return on preferred. But if there's debt in your company, are either of those exclusively unlevered equities? Or do the common stockholders get some value enhancement because of the appropriate utility of debt in the company? Didn't you borrow money so you could amplify some return by leverage?
Yeah, and I think that the value of the company going up because of smart investing, smart ways of funding your ventures is going to benefit the common stockholders. I just don't think it's represented in these figures.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree. So we would say that your RE is influenced by those returns the company is getting, which are in part a function of the smart use of debt, right?
Yes.
Okay, so RE is not unlevered. It's influenced by leverage. So I can't just take RE, I can't just take RP as unlevered. I got a problem when I do that, because if there's debt in the company at all, then the whole company is affected by the utility of that debt. I'd have to look at some companies that have zero debt. I don't mean a little bit, I mean zero debt. And I'd have to look at their capital returns in order to think of an unlevered cost of equity. And unfortunately, we have so few examples of that. Certainly in the public markets, we recognize them as anomalies. They're outliers. I mean, show me a company that has zero debt, and I will show you an anomaly, right? So KU is not an observable variable. It's a theoretical variable. And as it turns out, it's very hard to get our little heads around it. There's actually a multi-stage equation that we can use to estimate it by some reverse engineering, which equation I'm not going to expose you to, nor am I going to hold you responsible for. I just want you to look at this and play around a little bit with your models as you're building them. And you might even be able to approximate what could the costs of KU and K-tax be in order to come up with the same value as we've got for the KVD or for the FCF model or the KVD model. I know I'm going to play a little bit because I like playing what if games as much as anybody else. What if I'm going to have to make this number bigger or smaller? What do you think? In order to get APV, to come into alignment, am I going to have to make these numbers bigger or smaller? Well, if I need APV to grow and the discount rates are in the denominator, I need it for the value of the term to grow, the denominator's got to get smaller, right? So what's going to happen if I take this to 18% instead of 0.2017? It comes pretty close, doesn't it? Okay. Well, maybe I'd take it back to 20%, and this one goes to 0.04. Maybe it's 0.035. I can play games here. And all I'm doing is I'm going to converge on a point at which maybe I've got some magical combination that lets these numbers be the same. But the reality is it's very, very hard to know these numbers because Casey's utility of tax dollars and Stevie's utility of tax dollars and resentment of them maybe. And remember, it's opportunity cost. So what could I have done with these dollars instead are going to be different because of ideology and because of how they perceive and utilize government goods and services. And we can't observe KU. It's theoretical, it's fleeting. And so in practical terms, we rarely will use the APV model. In fact, the only time an APV model is going to be utilized in practical terms is where you have a huge debt component and a very small equity component in the company. Maybe like an old-time railroad. Okay? Any question about any of that? Okay, so a couple other things here as we wind this part up. When you're using different models, if you will come across slightly different model outcomes, like the KVD versus the free cash flow model. I'll show you yet another model next week that will give you yet again a slightly different outcome, but not as different as the APV, not as problematic as the APV model. If your model outcomes are more than 10% apart, then you're either using some of the inputs incorrectly or you are using the wrong model form for the company or the project at hand. In this course, we're not going to get into too much discussion about what the right model form is for the right project, the right model form for the right kind of company. That gets into heavy interpretation. That's a 7-week discussion all by its lonesome, okay? But just know that if you come up with 2 models and 2 separate valuations and they're within a 10% spread of each other, then you probably have used them well. And that spread is simply helping us understand that value isn't necessarily a singular numeric component. Jason might argue slightly differently than Kang might argue in the negotiations. And so we're going to come up with a range of values more often than we're going to come up with a singular value. Well, I might ask you to come up with an individual value for homework purposes and stuff, but recognize that we can come up with values till we're blue in the face, and they're simply going to inform our negotiations so that we can decide how much we'll actually pay or charge. And maybe we see some of that in the range of values that is constructed as we look at the outcomes of some of these different models. Any questions?
What's the most popular in business? Which model is used most frequently?
I will tell you that there's 2 that are used commonly, and we'll actually look at them kind of rigorously next week against each other. But one of them is a form of the free cash flow model. So we'll just call it the free cash flow model. That's considered an income-based approach. Remember we talked about production value? The first night of class we talked about you can value assets 3 ways. Either a market approach, a production value approach, or a asset-based approach using book value. Well, the production value, knowing that an asset produces incomes and cash flows for its investors, that is the free cash flow model, almost always. So the free cash flow model is discounted cash flow construction. And then there's a multiples-based construction using an enterprise value multiple, and we'll look at those next week. Those are the 2 most common.